ruins on the corner, big band music, war memorials, a squirrel cage? Centennial Park here in Holland, Michigan is not a particularly imposing landmark. The casual observer could easily overlook it or write it off as just another park. To visit this place today and fail to recognize its unique past, however, would do it a disservice. From European market to cow pasture to gathering place and emblem of Holland pride, Centennial Park possesses a rich and fascinating history that reflects on the greater patterns of the urban green space movement in the late 18 and early 1900s. Situated within this greater movement, Centennial Park engendered both civic and national pride in its use as a gathering place and as a pocket of natural beauty. Meanwhile, Holland's status as a small but budding Dutch-American town also caused the park to develop its own unique dynamic. To understand how Centennial Park both reflected and differed from the broader trends present during the early stages of its development, and how this informs our current understanding of the park, let's start at the beginning. In 1848, just a year after founding Holland, Albertus van Raalte set aside a portion of the land that would eventually become Centennial Park.
The founder of the city, Dr. van Raalte, and his early followers came here in 1847, envisioned the park as part of a so-called European marketplace. They were familiar with marketplaces in Europe where products, produce, livestock, and so forth were sold. And so they wanted to duplicate that, apparently, when they arrived here.
The space was named Market Square accordingly. However, Market Square was only briefly used as an actual marketplace. As the square was open land with no particular landscaping, some farmers used it as a grazing pasture. That is, until the city founders outlawed such practice and constructed a fence around the space. Then, in 1871, the Great Holland Fire struck. Although Market Square escaped the worst of the flames, the space still came out charred. The park remained unused until 1876, when Mayor Van Landingen proposed a new plan for Market Square. In response to a call by Michigan Governor John Bagley to mark the United States Centennial Year, Van Landingen proposed new landscaping that would completely repurpose the former Market Square. After some deliberation over the new name, the City Council settled on the name Centennial Park, in keeping with honoring the nation's anniversary, and formed a committee to continue the development of the space. Only about a century before these events, the concept of public parks was not common in Western culture. The movement for public green spaces emerged in the late 18th century British Isles, where aristocrats began to create arboretums, green spaces meant to preserve nature and act as pockets of natural perfection. These arboretums consisted primarily of a wide variety of planted trees and smaller plants. Although initially envisioned as private preserves, these arboretums became the inspiration for larger public parks in the late 19th century as the idea of planned green spaces spread to other Western European countries and to the United States. Public arboretums, as opposed to private, began as a way to extend the benefits of green spaces to the middle and working classes, especially in emerging industrialized and heavily populated cities. These same principles underlay the shift from public arboretums to public parks. The creators of early public parks developed them as beautiful, natural-looking spaces meant to improve health and morale in over-industrialized towns. They intended parks to promote middle and upper-class ideals of education, culture, and overall civilized relaxation and enjoyment. By the late 19th century, the transatlantic exchange of park ideas was on the rise. Both in Western Europe and in North America, as stated by historian Sonia Dumpelman, public parks were considered a signifier of social, political, and cultural progress. It was in this context that Centennial Park was born in 1876. Unlike rapidly industrializing metropolises where green spaces contrasted heavily with their surroundings, Holland was a small community. Still, like many of its counterparts in larger North American cities and in Western Europe, Centennial's early stages of development revealed a particular concern for its beautiful and natural appearance. The original plan for Centennial Park called for a knoll in the land center to be removed, replaced with an ellipse, and decorated with a centennial pole commemorating the nation's founding. Yet the Holland community generally wanted the knoll to remain, keeping with the park's natural landscaping. In the end, such was the controversy over this question of natural beauty that the park's original committee resigned angrily and a new committee assembled to complete and execute the park plan with the knoll intact. This communal concern for beauty was also evident in the story of the old townhouse that once stood on the park's northwest corner. Built in the 1860s and moved to the intersection of 10th and River in 1868, the townhouse performed various functions over the years, from city hall to jail to the fire station. By the late 1880s, however, the building was in a bad state.
1880s, Centennial Park had already been spruced up, and now it was a formal park, but this stupid building was still there on the corner. It was an eyesore.
Although the council wanted to tear down the dilapidated structure, the city continued to delay its removal until 1887, when the structure caught fire for the third time in a few years, likely due to arson.
So now the building stands in semi-ruins until finally the city council agrees we'll tear it down.
The editor of the Holland City News greeted this news with barely restrained happiness.
While the news does not want to be placed in the position of countenancing incendiaries of this nature, we cannot help but feel thankful that there is now a prospect of this eyesore being completely removed, and the park devoted to no other purpose than that for which it is intended.
This pointed concern for the development of the park reflected a desire similar to that of park planners in well-developed larger cities, that public green spaces be untouched pockets of nature.
Filled in. So by 1890 now, Centennial Park was whole. The building had been eliminated, and now you've got a complete park.
Centennial's directors continued to demonstrate a concern for aesthetics even in later years around the turn of the century. Around this time, Centennial Park saw the additions of seating, sidewalks, lights, a fountain, restrooms, and flowers, including Holland's famous tulips. Furthermore, it was in 1922 that the idea of installing a Van Raalte memorial statue was first proposed. These improvements to Centennial Park over the years indicated great pride in Holland's appearance and in its historical roots. In addition to displaying a concern for creating a natural and beautiful park, the stories of the townhouse and the knoll remind us that even the small park in a small city formed within a bigger context. Perhaps it is unsurprising that the citizens of Holland wanted their new park to look pleasant and green. Yet what seems logical to us today was perhaps more complex in the late 1800s. Had Holland simply mimicked the earlier development of larger cities, its citizens might not have incorporated something natural in its center until the city had grown significantly more crowded and industrialized. Yet, whether as a direct response to the wider movement or due simply to the natural beauty of the area, the idea of public green spaces reached the Holland community and manifested itself in Centennial Park. Although Centennial Park was shaped in part by a wider national movement, it was also shaped by the local community. Shortly after the park's founding, the city invited all residents of Holland to come help plant trees in the newly repurposed space. Even though the event was delayed by the rain, a significant host of townspeople still turned out to make a mark on the space. In this sense, the early Centennial Park was quite unlike large green spaces such as Central Park in New York City. Central Park's designer, Frederick Law Olmsted, disregarded potential working-class input and instead imposed upper-class ideals of how the working-class public should enjoy the space. Even somewhat smaller parks in large cities, like New York's Tompkins Square Park, posed problems for the working-class communities who wanted more ownership of the space. The city established Tompkins Square Park in hopes of raising property values and retaining some wealthier residents. However, the German immigrants who lived in the area used it as their own gathering space in ways that conflicted with the ideals of the park's upper-class creators. Back in Michigan, the citizens of the much smaller and newer town of Holland seem to have been much more directly involved from the early stages of Centennial Park's development. The town's size and relative socioeconomic homogeneity meant that the park's design could serve the entire population, allowing Holland citizens a sense of ownership of the space. This idea of civil ownership was unique at the time, as it was not fully implemented in larger cities until much later, after the turn of the 20th century. Unlike the parks of larger cities, Holland's Centennial Park was truly a place for the people. Although sometimes a point of contention, as with the arguments over the knoll and the townhouse, Centennial Park was a civic icon in which the town could take pride. Centennial Park was also a center of national pride. Even shortly after the initial establishment of the market square, Holland settlers demonstrated their love for their new country.
The marketplace idea waned after a decade or so because as new arrivals came to Holland, to Michigan, they didn't necessarily subscribe to that philosophy that we wanted a European-style market. They were Americans, and so they wanted to do as Americans do, be individual store owners and purveyors of products. So the market idea just kind of languished and no longer was valid.
Later, patriotism showed in Centennial's founding as a commemoration of the birth of the United States. Even beyond its initial establishment, though, Centennial Park remained an important site for the expression of national pride on the part of the Hollanders. The town used it for gatherings on such important holidays as Memorial Day and the 4th of July, featuring celebratory processions, orations, big band music, and even fireworks. As with ideas of civic ownership, such gatherings were not characteristic of the broader urban green space movement until much later. In addition to the town makeup that encouraged civic gatherings in general, the early appearance of distinctly American celebrations in such a heavily Dutch community may have stemmed simply from the park's name commemorating the American Centennial. Centennial Park would continue to foster national pride even in the years to come. Memorial Day and 4th of July festivals remained major celebrations in the park. The Holland City News detailed especially festive Memorial Day events in the early 1920s, complete with patriotic music, speeches, and parades. Although Centennial Park never became a venue for political rallies per se, one writer from the Holland Evening Sentinel in 1928 looked back fondly on the patriotism shown in years gone by.
The park was always a center for political speeches of all sizes and kinds. As a public meeting space for programs and band music and general discussion for beauty, Centennial Park has amply justified the expectations of the founder of Holland.
Hollanders also used Centennial Park to recognize and support war efforts. In 1908, 2 Civil War-era howitzer guns were placed in the park, though they were later donated as scrap metal during World War II. In late 1912, the first war memorial was installed in the park, commemorating Civil War Union soldiers. Patriotism even showed in the landscaping when, in 1914, citizens planted flowers in the shape of the American flag. All these expressions of national pride within Centennial Park reveal its unique position as a locally important venue whose history drove it towards broader connections to the United States at large. This modest park that began as a commemoration of the nation's 100th anniversary became a space where Holland citizens could examine and celebrate not only local culture, but the culture of the country as a whole. Though Centennial may seem insignificant on a national scale, these early stages of its development demonstrate the power of public gathering spaces to extend the community's vision beyond its isolated borders. Although its use as a gathering place appeared early in Centennial's history and ahead of the wider movement, the park did mirror a different critical shift, the shift to more recreational park purposes. Around the turn of the 20th century, especially in the United States, the park movement had begun to change. This new movement focused on more active recreation rather than on passive enjoyment of the natural environment. Generally speaking, public parks across the nation were no longer quiet pockets of nature meant solely for resting and contemplation. In larger cities, recreational departments and even a national playground association sprung into being. Some, like Boston, began to install zoos and auditoriums in their park systems. Even some smaller cities made the move to include outdoor recreational facilities like skating rinks and tennis courts in their parks. Although Centennial Park never installed recreational facilities on a particularly grand scale, it nonetheless was heavily influenced by this shift. Recreational park additions and events starting around the turn of the century included a regional farmers' picnic, a new fishing pond stocked by citizens from the surrounding community, a bandstand to be used for music concerts, a tree lighting ceremony, and a Christmas caroling tradition. All of these attractions, in addition to promoting more active recreation, continue to allow each citizen to contribute to their community park. Then, in 1913, the Holland City Park Board elected to create a squirrel cage, further demonstrating an increased focus on recreation. When Centennial's directors saw that Ann Arbor, Michigan had successfully implemented a squirrel cage, they wanted the same for Holland. Park directors saw squirrels as a way to make the area more friendly and entertain the local children. Although in later years, the cage was eventually removed, and although it wasn't a full-fledged zoo installed by some cities, the Centennial Park squirrels were a popular attraction. While Centennial Park did not perfectly align with the changes of the wider movement at the turn of the 20th century, shifts in park purpose nationally and worldwide heavily influenced it. Yes, Centennial Park had been used as a gathering place from early on. However, that was only one facet of the evolving broader green space movement. Centennial Park did not begin to employ a more recreationally focused attitude until the early 1900s. A great deal of purposeful idea swapping occurred across large cities, both nationally and internationally, and Centennial Park directors specifically began to look at other towns such as Ann Arbor for recreational inspiration. Centennial Park was reflective of parks across the nation at that time and paralleled the movement for recreational space, but on a smaller scale that took into account the interests of Holland's own community. In the end, Centennial Park's history is inseparable from the physical space that we enjoy today. The park has undergone many changes over the years, both in aesthetics and in purpose. Its early years, in the midst of a movement that emphasized the need to break away from pollution and business of urban life, assigned it the role of city gathering place and source of civic and national pride. Later, with the widespread desire for parks to become recreational spaces, new additions to Centennial Park allowed for more active participation and enjoyment, all with the continued goal of engaging the Holland citizens and beautifying the space. This small and somewhat unassuming park in the center of Holland may seem isolated from the bustle of the city, from the country, and from the world at large. Yet, even from its roots, Centennial linked the small city of Holland to broader cultures and communities, developing in many ways in tandem with the wider Greenspace movement that made its way from the British Isles to Midwestern North America. Meanwhile, Centennial Park's beginnings reveal a distinct space that grew out of the unique influences and personalities of the emerging city of Holland. So, when you next visit Centennial Park, whether for an organized event like Tulip Time or simply to take in the surroundings, remember that its importance extends far back in time and far beyond the city of Holland. This unique but intercultural green space would not be what it is today without its rich and complex past.
How does the park speak to individuals? I don't know. It's probably what you feel come out of the park. If you're looking for solitude, it's there. A lot of birds in the park. Squirrels are still there. A lot of history in the park if you're a history person. You make the park what you want to.